The dust cloud rose like smoke signals against the copper sky, and Frank Fletcher saw the vultures first, circling something that still moved among the red rocks 2 miles outside Ellsworth, Kansas. He urged his mare forward through the August heat of 1878, sweat pooling beneath his hat brim, gut tightening with the instinct that had kept him alive through 6 years of hard riding across this unforgiving land. What he found made his jaw clench so tight his teeth ached. A woman knelt in the dirt, her dark hair matted against her face, wrists bound so viciously behind her back that the hemp had drawn blood. Her cotton dress was torn at the shoulder, dust caked across fabric that might have been blue once. She lifted her head as his shadow fell across her, eyes like green glass meeting his with a defiance that should have been beaten out of someone in her condition. Frank dismounted in one fluid motion, his boots hitting packed earth as he drew the knife from his belt. She flinched, and something in that small movement made anger surge hot through his chest. He circled behind her, saw how the ropes had cut into tender flesh, and his hands were gentle despite their calluses as he worked the blade through the fibers. "Easy now," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. The last rope parted and she gasped, bringing her arms forward with a cry that was part relief, part agony as blood rushed back into starved limbs. He caught her before she collapsed, steadying her with one hand while returning his knife to its sheath. "No one owns you now." She stared at him like she was trying to determine if he was real or some fever dream conjured by sun exposure and dehydration. Her lips were cracked and bleeding when she tried to speak. Frank reached for his canteen, uncorked it, and brought it to her mouth. She drank like a woman dying of thirst, which she probably was, water running down her chin in rivulets that cleaned tiny paths through the dust. "Who did this?" Frank asked when she finally pulled back from the canteen, gasping for air. His eyes scanned the horizon, looking for the kind of tracks that would tell him how long she had been here, how many men had left her to die. "My husband," she said, and the word came out with such venom that Frank knew there was a story here as complex as the Badlands themselves. "Former husband, if God has any mercy." Frank studied her face properly now that some color was returning to it. She could not have been more than 22 or 23, with the kind of beauty that would have turned heads in any saloon from here to Santa Fe. But it was her eyes that held him, sharp and intelligent despite the ordeal she had endured. There was steel in this woman. "Harold Dillard," she continued, her voice gaining strength with each word. "He brought me west with promises of a fresh start in Kansas. What he wanted was unpaid labor and something he could control." She looked down at her bleeding wrists, then back up at Frank with that same fierce defiance. "When I told him I was leaving, he tied me up, took me out here, and said the desert could have me if I wanted freedom so badly." The rage that filled Frank was cold and purposeful, the kind that had made him a man to be reckoned with in 3 territories. But he pushed it down, focusing instead on the woman who needed help more than she needed to witness his anger. "Can you stand?" he asked. She nodded, pride keeping her spine straight even as her legs shook. Frank offered his arm and she took it, her fingers digging into his sleeve as she found her balance. The mare whinnied softly, and Frank led them both toward the animal with slow, careful steps. "What is your name?" he asked as he helped her into the saddle. She settled there with a wince, every muscle in her body clearly screaming protest. "Hannah," she said. "Hannah Dillard, though I would sooner spit on that surname than claim it now." "Frank Fletcher," he offered, swinging up behind her. His arms came around her to reach the reins, and he felt her stiffen before deliberately relaxing against him. Trust was a currency that had to be earned, and he respected her for not giving it freely. "I am taking you back to Ellsworth. There is a doctor there, and a boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Patterson who does not tolerate nonsense from anyone. Hannah was silent for a long moment, as the mare began the journey back toward town, her steady gait eating up ground while the sun continued its arc across the endless sky. Finally, she spoke again, her voice softer now. "Why did you help me?" Frank considered the question, thought about all the easy answers he could give. Because it was the right thing to do, because no one deserves to be left to die. Because he had been raised by a mother who taught him to respect women, and a father who taught him that a man who raises his hand against the defenseless was no man at all. "Because you deserved help," he said simply. "And because I know what it is like to want freedom badly enough to risk everything for it." She turned her head slightly, trying to see his face, and Frank caught the ghost of a smile on her cracked lips. They rode in silence after that, the only sounds the rhythmic fall of hooves and the distant cry of a hawk hunting over the grasslands. Ellsworth rose from the plains like a promise, its wooden buildings stark against the horizon. It was not much of a town, but it had everything a place needed to survive. A general store, a saloon, a church, a smithy, and enough honest people to balance out the rougher elements that drifted through with the cattle drives. Frank guided the mare down Main Street, aware of the stares they were attracting. Hannah kept her chin up, refusing to show weakness even as exhaustion pulled at her features. The doctor's office was a small building wedged between the barber and the telegraph office. Frank dismounted and lifted Hannah down, feeling how light she was, how much weight she must have lost under Harold Dillard's cruelty. The door swung open before they reached it, and Dr. Sela's ward appeared, his weathered face creasing with concern. "Good Lord, Frank, what have you brought me?" "A woman who needs help," Frank said curtly. "Her wrists need tending, and she has been without food and water for I do not know how long." Dr. Ward ushered them inside, clearing his examination table with efficient movements. He helped Hannah sit, then began carefully cleaning her wounds while Frank stood near the window, his hat in his hands, watching the street outside. His mind was already working through the problem of Harold Dillard, sorting through possibilities and consequences. "These rope burns are nasty, Doctor," Ward muttered, applying salve with gentle fingers. "Another few hours in that sun and we would be talking about serious consequences. You were lucky, young lady." "Lucky that Frank found me," Hannah said, her eyes finding his across the room. "Lucky that there are still good men in this world." Something passed between them in that moment, a connection that Frank felt like a spark catching dry tinder. He looked away first, uncomfortable with the intensity of whatever was building in his chest. "Doctor." Ward bandaged Hannah's wrists and provided her with water and a bit of bread to settle her stomach. He advised rest and regular meals, warning against trying to do too much too soon. Frank paid him with coins from his pocket, waving off Hannah's protests. "Where is Harold Dillard staying?" Frank asked as they left the doctor's office, his voice casual but his eyes hard. "The boarding house at the east end of town," Hannah said. "But Frank, I do not want you getting into trouble on my account. I can go to the sheriff, file a complaint." Frank shook his head. "Sheriff Morton is in Dodge City this week, helping with some rustler problem. His deputy is young and green, still figuring out which end of the law is which." He looked down at her, saw the fear trying to hide behind her brave facade. "I am not going to kill him, if that is what you are worried about. But your husband, former husband, needs to understand that his actions have consequences." They walked slowly down the wooden sidewalk, Hannah's steps growing steadier as food and water worked their magic. Frank found himself matching his stride to hers, hyper-aware of her presence beside him. She smelled like dust and sweat, but underneath was something else, something that reminded him of wild flowers growing in impossible places. Mrs. Patterson's boarding house was a two-story structure with a wide porch and lace curtains in the windows. The widow herself was on the porch, shelling peas into a bowl, her iron-gray hair pinned in a severe bun. She looked up as they approached, her sharp eyes missing nothing. "Frank Fletcher, is that a woman who looks like she has been dragged through hell backwards?" Mrs. Patterson stood, setting her bowl aside. "Bring her up here right now." Frank made introductions while Mrs. Patterson fussed over Hannah like a mother hen, already planning baths and meals and a proper room with clean sheets. Harold Dillard's name came up, and Mrs. Patterson's mouth became a thin line. "That man is staying here," she said flatly. "Left 3 hours ago saying he had business in town." "I do not suppose you want to be here when he returns, do you, dear?" "Actually," Hannah said, her voice stronger now with allies around her, "I think I do." Frank understood. She needed to face Harold, needed to look him in the eye as a free woman rather than as his victim. It was the kind of courage that Frank recognized and respected, the kind that could not be taught or faked. "Then we will wait," Frank said, settling into one of the porch chairs. Mrs. Patterson brought him coffee and gave Hannah a dress of her own, helping her inside to wash and change. Frank sat alone with his thoughts, watching the street, his hand never far from the revolver at his hip. Harold Dillard arrived as the sun was starting its descent, casting long shadows across Ellsworth's dusty streets. He was a big man, soft around the middle from too much easy living, with mean eyes and a mouth that turned down at the corners. He stopped dead when he saw Frank on the porch, some instinct warning him that things had changed. "Can I help you?" Harold's voice was aggressive, the tone of a man used to bullying others into submission. Frank stood slowly, his movements deliberate. "Harold Dillard, who is asking, the man who cut your wife loose from the ropes you left her in, out in the desert to die." Frank's voice was quiet, which made it all the more dangerous. "The man who is here to tell you that if you come within 100 yards of Hannah again, it will be the last decision you ever make." Harold's face went red, then purple. "That woman is my property, bought and paid for with a marriage certificate. What I do with her is my own business." The door opened behind Frank, and Hannah stepped out. She had washed the dust away, changed into Mrs. Patterson's blue calico dress, and despite the bandages on her wrists and the lingering exhaustion in her eyes, she looked regal. She looked free. "I am not your property," Hannah said, each word clear and precise. "I was never your property, Harold. That marriage ended the moment you left me to die. If you come near me again, I will shoot you myself." Harold took a step forward, his fists clenching, and that was as far as he got. Frank moved between them, his presence alone enough to freeze Harold in place. "You heard the lady," Frank said softly. "Now I suggest you pack your things and find somewhere else to stay. Mrs. Patterson does not want your business anymore." "That is damn right I do not," Mrs. Patterson called from inside. "You have 10 minutes to get your belongings out of my house, Harold Dillard, or I will throw them into the street myself." For a moment Frank thought Harold might actually try something stupid. He could see the calculation happening behind those mean eyes, weighing pride against survival. Survival won, as it usually did with cowards. Harold spat into the dirt, shot them all a look full of impotent rage, and stalked into the boarding house. Frank did not relax until Harold had collected his bags and left, heading toward the seedier end of town where questions were not asked and men like him could find refuge. Only then did he let out the breath he had been holding. "Thank you," Hannah said quietly. She was standing close enough that he could feel the warmth of her, see the pulse beating in her throat. "For everything." "You do not need to thank me for basic human decency," Frank said, but his voice had gone rough again, his carefully maintained control starting to slip in the face of her gratitude. Mrs. Patterson invited Frank to stay for supper, and he found himself accepting. They ate at the boarding house's long table, joined by the two other residents, an elderly man who worked at the telegraph office and a young couple newly arrived from Missouri. The food was simple but good, beef stew and cornbread, and Frank watched Hannah eat with an appetite that pleased him more than it should have. After dinner, Mrs. Patterson shooed everyone else away and left Frank and Hannah alone on the porch as twilight painted the sky in shades of purple and gold. The temperature had dropped with the sun, bringing blessed relief from the August heat. "What will you do now?" Frank asked, aware that this was the question that mattered most. Hannah was free, but freedom without resources was just another kind of prison. "I do not know," Hannah admitted. She was leaning against the porch railing, looking out at the town like she was seeing it for the first time. "I have no money of my own. Everything I brought into that marriage Harold spent or claimed. I can sew well enough to take in mending, I suppose, or I could ask at the general store if they need help." Frank nodded slowly, thinking. He owned a ranch about 5 miles out of town, a decent spread with good water and grassland that could support a fair number of cattle. He had built it up over 6 years of hard work, transforming it from a failing homestead into something profitable. He ran it alone, which meant long days and longer nights, but he had never minded the solitude. Until now, sitting beside this woman who had survived something that would have broken a weaker soul, Frank found himself minding the solitude very much indeed. "I could use help at my ranch," he heard himself say. "Someone to help with the house, maybe the kitchen garden, cook meals. It would be honest work and I pay fair wages. You would have your own room, your own space." He met her eyes directly, needing her to understand. "I am not Harold Dillard. I would not expect anything from you beyond the work we agreed upon." Hannah studied him for a long time, and Frank made himself stay still under her scrutiny, letting her look her fill. Whatever she saw must have satisfied her because she nodded slowly. "I accept," she said, "on one condition." "Name it." "You teach me to shoot. You said I should shoot Harold myself if he came near me again, and I meant what I said, but I do not actually know how to fire a gun." She smiled, and it transformed her face, chasing away shadows and revealing glimpses of who she must have been before Harold Dillard had tried to break her. "If I am going to make threats, I should know how to follow through on them." Frank felt an answering smile tug at his own mouth. "Deal." They shook hands on it, her grip firm despite the bandages, and Frank felt that spark again, stronger this time. He told himself it was just attraction, just the natural response to a beautiful woman. He told himself it would pass, that they would settle into an easy working relationship and nothing more. He was wrong on both counts. Hannah moved out to the ranch 3 days later, after Dr. Ward had cleared her and declared her wrists healing nicely. Frank drove her out in his wagon, her few possessions taking up barely any space in the bed. The ranch house was modest, 2 bedrooms and a main room that served as kitchen and living space, but it was solidly built with real glass in the windows and a stone fireplace that would keep it warm come winter. He showed her to the smaller bedroom, which had a real bed frame and mattress, a washstand, and a trunk for her clothes. She stood in the doorway, taking it all in, and Frank saw her eyes go bright with tears she refused to let fall. "It is perfect," she said simply. They fell into a routine over the following weeks. Hannah proved to be as capable as she was resilient, taking over the cooking and housekeeping with efficient grace. She tended the kitchen garden, coaxing tomatoes and beans from the Kansas soil, and started a small herb garden near the back door. She mended Frank's worn clothes, patched the holes in his socks, and turned the ranch house into something that felt like a home rather than just a place to sleep. Frank kept his promise about the shooting lessons. Every evening after the day's work was done, they would go out behind the barn with his extra revolver and a collection of tin cans. She was a terrible shot at first, flinching every time the gun went off, her aim sending bullets into the dirt or wide of any target. But she had the same determination she brought to everything else, and slowly, gradually, she improved. "Keep both eyes open," Frank said one evening, standing behind her, his hands hovering near hers as she aimed at a can 20 feet away. "You want to be focused on your target, not your sights. Trust your instincts." Hannah fired, and the can leaped into the air with a satisfying ping. She laughed with pure delight, turning toward Frank with her face alight, and he found himself laughing too. She was standing so close, her face tilted up toward his, and the space between them felt charged with possibility. Frank stepped back, suddenly aware of how easy it would be to cross lines that should not be crossed. Hannah was his employee under his protection. She had just escaped one man who had tried to control her. The last thing she needed was him complicating her life with feelings she might not share. But the feelings were there, growing stronger every day. He saw it in the way his heart lifted when he came in from the fields and smelled whatever she was cooking for dinner. He felt it in the comfortable silences they shared over meals, and in the sound of her humming while she worked. He watched her gain back the weight she had lost, saw color return to her cheeks and light return to her eyes, and took a fierce pride in knowing he had helped make that possible. Summer mellowed into fall, and with the change in seasons came the hard work of preparing for winter. Frank spent long days reinforcing fences and making sure his small herd of cattle had adequate shelter. Hannah helped where she could, learning to ride well enough to check the livestock, and showing an unexpected aptitude for working with the animals. They were in the barn one October afternoon, Frank teaching Hannah how to properly saddle a horse when she suddenly went still. He followed her gaze to the barn door and felt his entire body tense. Hannah Dillard stood there, swaying slightly, clearly drunk, his hand resting on the gun at his hip. "Thought I would find you out here," Harold slurred, his mean eyes fixed on Hannah. "Playing house with your new man. Did you think I would just let you go? Did you think there would not be consequences?" Frank moved in front of Hannah, his hand falling to his own revolver. "You need to leave, Harold, right now, while you still can." "She is my wife," Harold said, but there was a whining quality to it now, the bluster of a weak man trying to reassert control he had lost. "The law says she is my wife." "The law also says you cannot leave someone to die in the desert," Frank replied evenly. "You want to have that conversation with the sheriff. He got back from Dodge City last week, and I am sure he would be very interested to hear Hannah's story." Harold's face twisted with rage and something else, something that might have been shame if he were capable of such an emotion. His hand tightened on his gun, and Frank saw the exact moment when Harold made his decision. "Do not," Frank said, his voice cutting like a blade. "You draw that weapon, and I will end you. That is not a threat, Harold. That is a promise." The barn filled with tense silence, broken only by the soft sounds of horses shifting in their stalls and Harold's labored breathing. Frank could feel Hannah behind him, could sense her fear but also her trust that he would protect her. That trust steadied him, kept his hand calm and ready. Harold's courage, what little there was of it, broke under Frank's stare. His hand fell away from his gun, and his shoulders slumped in defeat. "This is not over," he muttered, but they all knew it was. He turned and stumbled out of the barn, heading back toward town on foot. Frank waited until Harold was out of sight before he finally relaxed, turning to check on Hannah. She was pale but composed, her jaw set in that way he had come to recognize as her facing down fear. "He is pathetic," she said quietly. "I cannot believe I ever let him make me feel small." "He is also dangerous when he is drunk," Frank replied. "I am riding into town to file a formal complaint with Sheriff Morton. Harold needs to understand that there will be consequences if he comes near you again." Hannah caught his arm as he moved past her, her fingers wrapping around his wrist just above where his gun belt sat. "Frank, be careful." He looked down at her hand, then up at her face, and saw everything he had been feeling reflected back at him in her green eyes. The awareness had been building for weeks, simmering just below the surface of their daily interactions, and suddenly it broke through. "Hannah," he said, his voice rough with the weight of everything he wanted to say. "I need you to know that when I offered you this job, I had no expectations beyond honest work, but I would be lying if I said my feelings had not changed. If I said that I do not think about you every moment of every day." Her breath caught, her fingers tightening on his wrist. "My feelings have changed too," she whispered. "I did not think I would ever want to trust a man again after Harold, but you are not like him. You are nothing like him." Frank reached up with his free hand, cupping her cheek with a gentleness that contrasted with the calluses on his palm. "I am going to ride into town and deal with the Harold situation. When I get back, we are going to talk about this properly. About us. If you want there to be in us." "I want that very much," Hannah said, and there was no hesitation in her voice, no doubt in her eyes. He kissed her then, unable to resist the pull any longer. It was soft and careful, a question more than a demand, and when she kissed him back with matching tenderness, Frank felt something settle in his chest. Something that felt like coming home. The ride into town was quick, Frank's mind already composing what he would say to Sheriff Morton. The sheriff was a fair man, tough but reasonable, and he listened carefully as Frank laid out the situation. Harold had been staying at a run-down hotel near the saloon, drinking his way through what remained of his money, but when the sheriff went looking for him, Harold was gone. His room was empty, his belongings cleared out, and the hotel owner said he had paid up and left that afternoon, heading east. "Coward ran," Sheriff Morton said with satisfaction. "Probably for the best. I was ready to lock him up for what he did to Miss Hannah, but now it sounds like he is someone else's problem." Frank felt relief wash over him. With Harold gone, truly gone this time, Hannah could finally put that chapter of her life behind her. She could move forward without looking over her shoulder, could build something new without the shadow of her past hanging over everything. He rode back to the ranch as the sun was setting, painting the grasslands in shades of amber and crimson. Hannah was waiting on the porch, and the smile that lit her face when she saw him made Frank's heart kick hard against his ribs. "He is gone," Frank said as he dismounted, leaving the mare ground-tied. "Cleared out of town, heading east," the sheriff checked. Hannah's shoulders sagged with relief, and she pressed a hand to her chest like she was trying to calm her racing heart. "It is really over then." "It is really over," Frank confirmed. He climbed the porch steps, stopping just in front of her, close enough to touch but waiting for her to close the remaining distance. "Now we can talk about the future. Our future, if you want that." Hannah looked up at him, her green eyes searching his face. "What kind of future did you have in mind, Frank Fletcher?" "The kind where you do not work for me anymore," he said, his voice steady despite the nerves jumping in his gut. "The kind where we are partners, equal in everything. Where this ranch is ours, not mine. Where we build a life together if you will have me." She reached up, her bandaged wrists now fully healed, and framed his face with her hands. "Are you asking me to marry you?" "I suppose I am," Frank said, and he could not help the smile that spread across his face. though I am making a mess of it. I do not have a ring, and this is not very romantic, standing on the porch covered in trail dust." "It is the most romantic thing anyone has ever said to me," Hannah replied, her eyes bright with tears that were joyful this time, not sorrowful. "Because you are offering me a choice, asking what I want, seeing me as your equal. Harold never did any of that. So yes, Frank. Yes, I will marry you." He kissed her again, longer this time, deeper, pouring everything he felt into the connection between them. She responded with matching intensity, her arms wrapping around his neck as she pressed closer. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Frank rested his forehead against hers. "We will do this right," he murmured. "I will court you properly, buy you a ring, marry you in the church with the whole town watching." "I do not need any of that," Hannah said, but she was smiling. "I just need you." "You have me," Frank promised. "For as long as you want me, you have me." They were married 3 weeks later in Ellsworth's small church with Mrs. Patterson crying happy tears in the front pew and half the town turning out to witness the ceremony. Frank bought Hannah a simple gold band from the general store, and she wore a new dress that Mrs. Patterson had helped her sew from fabric Frank had purchased. It was cream-colored cotton with tiny blue flowers embroidered along the collar, and Frank thought she had never looked more beautiful. Sheriff Morton gave Hannah away, having taken a grandfatherly interest in her welfare. Dr. Ward attended with his wife, and even the young couple from the boarding house came, along with what felt like every decent person in town. It was a celebration not just of a marriage but of justice, of survival, of two people finding each other against impossible odds. The preacher pronounced them man and wife, and when Frank kissed his bride, the church erupted in applause and cheers. They walked out into the November sunshine as Mr. and Mrs. Fletcher, and Frank felt like the richest man in Kansas, despite the modest coins in his pocket. The winter that followed was one of the happiest times of Frank's life. He and Hannah settled into married life with an ease that suggested they had been together for years, rather than months. They worked side by side during the day, Hannah now taking on more of the ranch duties as an equal partner. She proved to have a good eye for cattle, able to spot illness or injury before it became serious, and she took over the books, tracking their expenses and income with meticulous care. At night they would sit by the fire, Frank reading while Hannah worked on her sewing, comfortable in the silence that had become their language. And when they retired to their shared bedroom, Frank discovered new depths to his feelings for his wife, physical expressions of the love that had grown between them. Spring arrived with the usual burst of life, the grasslands greening up and wildflowers blooming in impossible profusion. The ranch prospered under their combined care, the cattle herd growing as Frank invested in new stock. They talked about the future, about expansion, about maybe hiring a hand or two to help with the workload. It was on a warm May morning when Hannah made her announcement. They were sitting at the breakfast table, Frank working his way through eggs and bacon while planning the day's tasks, when Hannah set down her fork with a deliberate clink. "I am with child," she said, her voice carrying a mixture of joy and nervousness. "Dr. Ward confirmed it yesterday when I went into town for supplies." Frank froze, his fork halfway to his mouth as the words registered. Then he was moving, his chair scraping back as he crossed to Hannah's side, dropping to his knees beside her chair. His hands found hers, gripping tight enough to feel her pulse beating against his palms. "A baby," he said wonderingly. "We are going to have a baby." "Are you happy?" Hannah asked, and there was vulnerability in the question that made Frank's chest ache. "I know we have not talked about children, and maybe it is too soon, but I am so happy, Frank. I want this child so much. I am happier than I have ever been in my entire life," Frank said fiercely. He pulled her down into a kiss that tasted like joy and promises, his hands coming up to cradle her face. "You have given me everything, Hannah. A home, a partner, a purpose, and now a child. I do not have words for how much I love you." The pregnancy progressed through the summer months, and Frank watched his wife bloom like the flowers in her garden. She carried the baby well, her energy remaining high even as her belly swelled. Frank found himself constantly worried, hovering, until Hannah finally laughed and told him she was pregnant, not made of glass. They prepared a nursery in the room that had been Hannah's when she first came to the ranch, Frank building a cradle from oak he had been saving for a special project. Hannah sewed tiny clothes and blankets, her face soft with contentment as she worked. Mrs. Patterson organized a quilting bee with the women from town, and they presented Hannah with a beautiful baby quilt pieced together from scraps of fabric that held meaning. A bit of Mrs. Patterson's wedding dress, a scrap from the blue calico Hannah had worn the night she agreed to marry Frank, fabric from various other milestone moments. The baby came in early December, arriving during a cold snap that had ice forming on the windows and frost covering the ground. Dr. Ward made it to the ranch just in time, his buggy racing through the freezing air, and Frank paced the main room while Hannah's cries echoed from the bedroom. He had faced down armed men, survived harsh winters and brutal summers, but nothing in his life had prepared him for the terror of hearing his wife in pain and being unable to help. When the baby's cry finally rang out, strong and healthy, Frank felt his knees go weak with relief. Dr. Ward emerged moments later, his weathered face split with a grin. "You have a son, Frank, a healthy baby boy, and Hannah is just fine. Tired, but fine." Frank did not remember crossing the room, but suddenly he was in the doorway of the bedroom, looking at the most beautiful sight he had ever witnessed. Hannah sat propped up against pillows, her hair damp with sweat, her face exhausted but radiant. In her arms was a tiny bundle wrapped in the quilted blanket, and when she looked up at Frank, her smile was incandescent. "Come meet your son," she said softly. Frank approached slowly, almost reverently, and Hannah shifted the bundle so he could see the baby's face. His son had a shock of dark hair, a button nose, and the most perfect tiny hands Frank had ever seen. One of those hands was curled into a fist, waving slightly as the baby made soft sounds. "He is perfect," Frank whispered, terrified to speak too loudly and disturb this fragile miracle. "Hannah, he is perfect." "What should we name him?" Hannah asked. They had discussed names over the past months but had not settled on anything definite, wanting to wait until they met their child. Frank thought about his own father, a good man who had died too young, and about Hannah's father, who she remembered with fondness despite his passing when she was just a girl. He thought about new beginnings and fresh starts, about the life they had built from ashes and determination. "What about Samuel?" Frank suggested. "It means heard by God, and I feel like we have been heard, like our prayers have been answered." "Samuel Fletcher," Hannah said, testing the name. Their son made another small sound, and she laughed. "I think he approves." Dr. Ward left them alone with instructions for Hannah's recovery and the baby's care, promising to check on them in a few days. Frank sat beside the bed, unable to take his eyes off his wife and son, marveling at how his life had transformed. Barely more than a year ago, he had been a man alone, focused only on survival and building his ranch. Now he had a family, real and solid and more precious than any amount of gold. The winter months passed in a blur of sleepless nights and overwhelming love. Samuel was a good baby, healthy and strong, though he had powerful lungs when he wanted attention. Frank discovered depths of patience he had not known he possessed, walking the floor at 3 in the morning with his son while Hannah caught a few hours of sleep. He learned to change diapers and mix formula to supplement Hannah's nursing, and he found joy in every small milestone. The first time Samuel smiled, the way his eyes would track movement, the tiny grip of his fingers around Frank's thumb. Spring returned, and with it came the endless work of the ranch. But it was easier now with Samuel's cradle set up in whatever room they were working in, the baby sleeping or watching with wide eyes as his parents moved around him. Hannah had regained her strength and energy, returning to her share of the ranch duties with determination while still putting Samuel's needs first. They celebrated Samuel's first birthday in December of 1879, inviting Mrs. Patterson and several friends from town out to the ranch. The house was warm and full of laughter, and Frank stood back at one point, watching Hannah hold their son while she talked with Mrs. Patterson, and felt his heart swell, almost painfully. "You have done well for yourself, Frank," Sheriff Morton said, coming to stand beside him with a cup of cider in his hand. "A good woman, a fine son, a prosperous ranch. Some men spend their whole lives searching for what you have found." "I know," Frank said quietly. "Believe me, I know how lucky I am." The years that followed brought their share of challenges. There were droughts that had Frank digging deeper wells and hauling water to keep his cattle alive. There were winters brutal enough to test even his hardened resilience. There were market fluctuations that ate into their profits and forced them to be creative about expenses. But through it all, Frank and Hannah faced everything together, their partnership growing stronger with each obstacle they overcame. Samuel grew into a bright, energetic boy with his mother's green eyes and his father's steady temperament. Frank taught him to ride before he could barely walk, and Hannah taught him his letters and numbers. He was a ranch child through and through, as comfortable with livestock as he was with books, curious about everything and fearless in the way only children could be. When Samuel was 4, Hannah announced another pregnancy. This time, Frank was prepared for the worry and the joy, and their daughter arrived in the spring of 1884, a tiny perfect replica of her mother with the same dark hair and green eyes. They named her Rose, for Hannah's mother, and Samuel took his role as big brother seriously, always wanting to help care for his little sister. The ranch continued to grow and prosper under Frank and Hannah's management. They eventually hired 2 hands to help with the increased workload, good men who respected Hannah's authority as much as Frank's. The ranch house was expanded, adding another bedroom and a proper dining room, transforming it from a modest homestead into something substantial. Through everything, the love between Frank and Hannah only deepened. They still took time in the evenings to sit together, though now it was often with children climbing on them or demanding stories. They still found moments to be alone, to remember what had brought them together, and to celebrate what they had built. On quiet nights, Frank would sometimes pull Hannah close and whisper his thanks for the day he had seen those vultures circling, for having the curiosity to investigate, for finding the woman who would become his whole world. "No one owns you now," he had said that day, cutting her free. But what he had learned in the years since was that freedom was not about being owned or not owned. It was about choosing your path, choosing your partner, choosing the life you wanted to build. And every single day, Hannah chose him, just as he chose her. Time continued its steady march, bringing the children toward adulthood. Samuel grew tall and strong, taking naturally to ranch work and showing the same quiet competence that defined his father. Rose was spirited and clever, equally at home helping her mother in the kitchen or riding the range with her father and brother. They both attended the school that had been built in Ellsworth, receiving educations that neither Frank nor Hannah had fully gotten, preparing them for a future that offered more possibilities than either parent had known. As Frank aged into his 40s, his body showing the wear of decades of hard work, he found himself reflecting often on the strange paths life could take. He thought about the man he had been, solitary and self-sufficient, believing he needed nothing beyond his ranch and his independence. He thought about how wrong he had been, how much richer his life had become with Hannah beside him, with children to raise and a legacy to build. On their 10th anniversary, Frank took Hannah into town and bought her a proper engagement ring from the jeweler who had recently set up shop. It was a simple design, a single diamond set in gold, but Hannah cried when he slipped it onto her finger beside her wedding band. "You did not have to do this," she said, but he could see how pleased she was, how she kept looking at the ring as it caught the light. "I wanted to," Frank replied, pulling her close. "I wanted you to have something beautiful, something that shows the world how much I value you." They walked through Ellsworth holding hands, and people smiled to see them, the couple who had become something of a legend in town. The story of how Frank had rescued Hannah from certain death had grown over the years, embellished and romanticized, but the core truth remained. They had found each other in the harshest circumstances and had built something lasting from that foundation. By the time Frank reached his 50th year, the ranch was one of the most successful in the county, known for quality cattle and honest dealing. Samuel was 21 and ready to take on more responsibility, showing the same dedication to the land that his father had. Rose, at 17, was being courted by a young man from town, a lawyer's son with good prospects and a gentle nature that reminded Hannah of Frank when they had first met. The children's futures were assured, the ranch was thriving, and Frank and Hannah were still deeply in love after more than 15 years of marriage. They had weathered every storm, celebrated every victory, and grown together in ways that made them stronger as individuals and as a couple. One evening in late summer, with the prairie grass golden in the setting sun and cicadas singing their evening chorus, Frank and Hannah sat on their porch watching Samuel work a young horse in the corral. Rose was in town with her young man, and the house behind them was quiet, dinner finished and dishes cleaned. Hannah leaned against Frank's shoulder, her hair now showing threads of silver, her face carrying lines that spoke of laughter and life well lived. Frank wrapped his arm around her, breathing in the familiar scent of her, still marveling that she was his, that they had built this life together. "Do you ever think about that day?" Hannah asked softly. "The day you found me." "Every day," Frank admitted. "I think about how easily I could have ridden in a different direction, how close we came to never meeting." "But you did not ride in a different direction," Hannah said, turning to look up at him. "You came toward the danger instead of away from it. You cut me free and gave me back my life." "And you gave me mine," Frank replied, kissing her forehead. "Everything good in my life started the day I found you, Hannah. The ranch was just a place before that. Now it is a home. I was just surviving before that. Now I am living." Hannah smiled, that same fierce, beautiful smile that had caught his attention so many years ago. "We have been very lucky, Frank Fletcher." "Yes, we have," he agreed, pulling her closer as the sun continued its descent. "Yes, we have." They sat together in the gathering twilight, watching their son work with patient expertise, listening to the sounds of their ranch settling for the night, secure in the knowledge that their love story, which had begun in desperation and dust, had transformed into something solid and enduring. The cowboy who had cut her ropes and told her no one owned her had become the husband who chose her every day, just as she chose him. And in a world as harsh and unforgiving as the Kansas plains, that was its own kind of miracle. Their story was far from over, But the foundation was set, built on trust and respect, and a love that had proven itself through trial and time. Whatever challenges the future might bring, Frank and Hannah would face them together, partners in every sense of the word, two souls who had found each other against all odds and refused to let go. The stars emerged one by one overhead, the same stars that had witnessed their first meeting, their first kiss, the birth of their children, and every moment of joy and struggle in between. And beneath that vast Kansas sky, Frank Fletcher held his wife close and counted himself the luckiest man who had ever lived.